will be the nature of religionless society. And so that was then. Now, huddled small sects resisting worldwide secular culture. You know, where are we with religion and politics? You know, Patriarch Kirill probably wouldn't have had a place in Stalin or Lenin's regime, but he gets hugged and kissed every time he's met by Putin, because Putin needs the Orthodox Church for the state that he is establishing. Now, I won't say that President Obama needs Pope Francis as much as Kirill is needed by Putin, but these two pictures from the last year or so reflect the new reality of the power of contemporary religion. And what does this mean in scholarly terms? Well, Peter Berger himself, you just saw the quote, huddled religious sects hiding in the corner. Peter Berger, now 10 years ago, the assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today is as furiously religious as it ever was. Secularization theory is essentially mistaken. And in that study, in that chapter, and in a lot of things that he's written since, he says, I was one of the people who argued that religion was going to disappear in modern society. And I was wrong. It hasn't, and it's now a part of modernity. And so the nature of what is going on, the nature of the debates, has shifted from being the advocates of secular modernity versus the advocates of religious non-modernity to what kind of secular religious modernity, what kind of secularious society do we have and should we be striving for? Now, as we look then at what this says for those of us who are stuck, you're writing theses, I still have to write chapters and so on. For those of us who are stuck, what are the implications? Yeah?
You're stating that secularism is not disappearing. Is it then measured? Because, okay, we saw the picture of the Pope, but does that reflect how religious or secular we are? I don't think so. So is it measured?
Mm-hmm. What it measures is that what secularism is now is what it was not in the 1960s, what it was not 50 years ago. Secularism has, as we can see, I think, in, say, these, quote, secular responses in France or in the United States. Secularism has become a content-based, dogmatic, ideological position. So from my point of view, secularism used to be an arrangement, and it is now a sect, in the States in particular, but and here, in the European Union, you have secularism being defined as a way of life. And you look at what people are talking about when they're talking about secular. And they talk about modern science, you know, and the religionists reject modern science. Well, modern religion always has had a cosmology. And what secularism has done is it has adopted the cosmology of a particular era's science. Now, it happens to be the science that I think is correct, but it still is my science kind of thing. When I took science, I told you, I'm really ancient. When I took modern science in college, people still thought that the Big Bang Theory was a crazy idea of some nutty Englishman, some nutty English astronomer. When I took college geology, plate tectonics didn't even exist. All of my professors truly believed in their particular science. But their particular science is not the science of the 21st century. But so that secularism defines a way of life. How do you act in the public sphere? Again, the issues are, say, stateside, but they're general. One of the issues in the United States is whether or not used to be, now it's long since decided, whether or not public schools could begin the day with a prayer. And it was argued that that violated the Establishment Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and therefore schools could not begin with a prayer. Now, quite frankly, from my analytical position, saying that if there is a God, he or she doesn't care whether or not you begin your school day with a prayer, that is as religious a statement as saying, God, he wants you to pray. They're both religious statements. And the old tradition of removed objective secularity has become religionized. So now let me just say, our topic, we could each of us could write a 100-page encyclopedia or a 100-volume encyclopedia and go on and still have stuff to say afterwards. So that thank you for making a comment and asking a question, because I will keep on talking. We'll always have something to say, and there's too much to say for the 2 hours. So that if we have to take one thing out, we can put something. We can put your thoughts in. So keep that in mind. I like to say, in the old days, back when President Nixon was in political trouble and so on, we discovered that there was such a thing as a voice-activated tape recorder. So that in the White House, in the Oval Office, there was this machinery that didn't operate until there was a voice, and it was a voice-activated thing. Well, I'm the opposite of that. I'm a silence-activated voice. If nobody talks, if nobody asks, then I babble. But I think that this is important, because what we've got then, so far as I'm concerned, there's a marvelous book, if you want to pursue some of this, called Rethinking Secularism, edited with many of the articles written by Calhoun, Juergensmeyer, and Van Antwerpen. But basically, they set a kind of an agenda that I think is research important. The rise of politically active religion not only encroaches on the supposed relationship between religion and secularism, thus challenging our thinking about the public role of religion, but it also queries our operative notions of secularism. The rise of politically active religious movements complicates our ideas about modern life. What they are saying, what the authors in this book, in this collection are saying is that how we define religion, how we define secularism, how we define the modern state, how we define the public square, all of these things in the 21st century are different from what they were 50 years ago or 100 years ago in the modern state context. Now, as we looked at it, I think that in this rethinking, one of the things that is useful to be reminded of is that I haven't said much of anything outstandingly new. Most people now argue that the old secularization theory was off base, that it didn't work, that religion didn't disappear. There's a marvelous article by the sociologist of religion, Rodney Stark, that the title is Secularization Theory RIP, Rest in Peace. It's dead, it's buried. Most scholars who deal with modern Islamic movements start with this idea, the old guys got it all wrong, secularization theory is wrong, and so on. And that's right, that's correct. But then when they go to analyze the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or Gastarbeiter Muslims in Germany, or, you name it, in Europe, or black Muslims in Chicago, they still use the analytical framework of the 1960s as seeing religion and secular as being competing things. The real battle in Egypt, there was a very good, very well-informed study last summer put out by the Carnegie Endowment on contemporary politics in Egypt under the coup regime. Notice I said coup. The coup regime of General Sisi. These are all people who, if you ask them about secularization theory, there were 3 co-authors. If you ask, I've heard them. They're good friends of mine. Secularization theory is dead. They were wrong. Religion didn't disappear. And then when they say, now, the fundamental problem in Egypt, the fundamental battle in Egypt right now is the secularists versus the religionists. And quite frankly, in terms of the structure of the sentences and the grammar and so on, they could have been writing in the 1960s. Secularization theory failed. However, when we're actually dealing with religious movements and secular movements, we still have to keep the old categories. And what I would like you to think about is, what are the alternatives? What can we use? And we're not stuck with ugly language necessarily, but we do need to be recognizing that there are new alternatives. And I think as we study Islam, whether it's in Europe or North America or Southeast Asia or the Middle East, one of the dimensions that we miss, sort of the policy analysts and people like that, is the new nature of the analysis and the contributions that are being made by scholars and analysts and intellectuals who are Muslim. In academia, very often, you end up with a kind of distinction being made. Usually a subconscious distinction. But as you look at who writes about secularism in Islam and so on, if a person's name is Ahmed, as in Ahmed Guru, for example, and he writes about Islam in Turkey, Ahmed Guru is a scholar. He's a member of the American Political Science Association. He was the head of the religion and politics section of that association and so on. People read him as a scholar. But he's also a Turkish Muslim who's contributing to Turkish self-awareness of politics and religion. Probably one of the most important scholars in the rethinking of secularism in the contemporary world. Quoted in almost every study. Charles Taylor and Jose Casanova, some of the old classics as well as the contemporary, is somebody by the name of Talal Asad. Now, Talal doesn't sort of march in protests necessarily for Islamic causes, but he is working to reconceptualize religion and the secular and Islam within it. If you've never had any contact with Talal, I would urge you to kind of look. You can Google. He, especially for those of you who are in anthropology, Talal's small book toward an anthropology of Islam is very useful in this sort of analytical rethinking. Now, Talal argues, for example, the secularism as a political doctrine, not as an objective, rational, analytical method, but Secularism as a political doctrine is closely connected to the formation of religion itself as the other of a religious order. It is precisely in a secular state that it is essential for state law to define again and again what genuine religion is. In other words, the separation of religious institution and state in a modern style state, that separation is in fact impossible, because law has to define how people act in the public square. And therefore, the definition of what is a religious act is a state function. You know, it's what is a doctrinally correct religious act is the function of an infallible pope or an imam or a rabbi and so on. The function of what is doctrinally correct or faithfully correct or theologically correct, that's the pope's business or the imam's business or so on. But the definition of legally correct religious activity in the public square has to be defined by the state. And the instant you say that, even if the state says the state can't define it, even if the state says the state can't define it, that's taking a religious position. And so that we have then this idea that secular and religious are interacting parts of a socio-intellectual political unit, set of relationships and modes of doing things. So we first off then, we have this sort of bringing together of definition of religion and definition of secular. The definition of church, mosque, temple, and so on, and state. It is an interacting part. Now some of you may be familiar, if you've read about secularism, with the work of Charles Taylor. And Taylor talks about the history of secularism. And secularism has changed in terms of what it was. Originally, it's always interesting, originally secular was a religious office. That in medieval times in the West, the church had two parts, if you will. You had the monasteries, the monks, the devotional, prayerful church, and then you had the parishes out in the world. And the priests who were out in the world were identified as secular priests. So that all secular meant was acting religiously out in the material world. But then you got, Taylor argues, you had an evolution through the Enlightenment and 19th century rationalism and so on.